Welcome. My name is Ross Emmett, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty at Arizona State University. The center is part of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at ASU, as well as part of the W.P. Carey School of Business. And it has the mission of evaluating the contribution of economic liberty to human betterment. I'm excited to welcome you to today's event because a little more than 2 years ago, Steve Slavinsky, who you will meet today, and I decided to initiate the Doing Business North America project, knowing that the research that was generated by it would contribute to the center's mission. Today, we celebrate the launch of the project's second DBNA report, which provides insight into the ease of doing business in 130 cities across all the states and federal districts of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The purpose of today's seminar is both to introduce the DBNA report and also point out new research directions that will use DBNA indicators. We will also examine how the DBNA report relates to other reports that focus on economic liberty. I'm happy to welcome Dean Stansel of the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom at Southern Methodist University in joining us today. Dean is well known as the primary author of the Economic Freedom of North America report produced by the Fraser Institute, and he also leads the Region Foundation's U.S. Metropolitan Area Economic Freedom Index. Dean earned his PhD in economics at George Mason University and worked for about a decade at the Cato Institute. Speaking first today, in order to introduce the DBNA report, will be Steve Slavinsky, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty and the Director of the DBNA project. Steve also has a master's in economics from George Mason, and he and Dean were briefly at the Cato Institute together. I'll turn things over now to Steve to introduce the DBNA report.
Thank you, Ross, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar. We're really excited about the DBNA 2020 release. I'll be explaining to you shortly why we are so excited, but also give you a sense of what the project is generally. Let me go ahead and pop up my slides here so you can all see what I'm seeing. And here it is. This is the tool for ranking state and local business regulations, which is the heart and the spirit of Doing Business North America. So, what we do every year, and this is our second year, the goal is to take stock of the scale and scope of business regulations. In this year, 130 cities, over 92 states, provinces, and federal districts, so that does include the District of Columbia, across Canada, Mexico, and the United States. We did 115 cities in 2019, so we've added 15 new ones for DBNA 2020. We also use 111 measures to score and rank cities. And I'll be talking briefly in a second about what those categories and those variables are. But we've actually added quite a few of them for this year as well. So DBNA 2020 is actually quite a large expansion in both the number of cities that we have available to provide data for, all publicly available data sources put together over the course of a year by a team of 8 students and 1 project assistant every year to put together this data. Is a team effort. So I would be remiss if I didn't thank Paul Bernert on our team and all of the really fantastic student workers we have who are helping us on this project. And so you'll see in a moment why it is such a substantial project, because we measure these 111 categories and group them into 6 different categories. And this is basically a tracking of the life cycle of a business, all the way from starting the business, employing workers, getting electricity to run your business, the ability to use the land and space that you own or are renting for the purpose of your business, paying taxes once you make a profit, or potentially writing off losses if you don't. And if you have too many of those losses, you end up possibly going into bankruptcy. The creative destruction of an economy is very important. In some countries, might make it more difficult to shut down businesses. And so we have a category which is national in nature, and I'll talk a little bit about that shortly, of resolving insolvency, which is basically a measure of bankruptcy law in the country in which the city resides. Let me go ahead into the main event. I'm sure everyone is interested in knowing what our top 5 cities are for this year. The Ease of Doing Business score is the aggregation of all of the categories and an averaging of all the scores across the board. And so here are our top 5 US cities in the Ease of Doing Business and in the DBNA 2020. Start with Raleigh, North Carolina, Jackson, Mississippi, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and Charleston, South Carolina. One thing that's interesting and that unites all of these categories, or rather, excuse me, all of these cities, is that they tend to do best in 3 specific categories. They do best in employing workers, in land and space use, and paying taxes. What's unique about this and rather interesting is that the land and space use category, for those of you who might be DBNA 2019 fans, we used to call that registering property, and that category is expanded to talk more about not just registering that property, although that is still an important part of that category, but it's also about the ability to again, use your space and your land as you see fit. And these cities actually benefited greatly. A large number of the cities in the top 10 are actually new cities, largely based on the strength of their scores in those 3 categories. Here are the bottom US cities. I think this is maybe not too surprising for those of us who follow city policy. Newark, New Jersey is 76. 77 is San Diego, California. You might notice a little jump here to 79. We'll get to that in a little bit. 79th is San Jose, California. 80th is New York, New York. And 81 is Los Angeles, California. These are all weighted at the bottom of the list of US cities, but we also do Canada and US cities. And so here's an interesting new insight that we discovered with DBNA 2020. A city of Edmonton in Alberta actually got higher than a lot of the lower ranked US cities like Los Angeles and New York. And so Edmonton is actually more competitive in a lot of ways. But what's interesting about the grouping of the cities, it didn't change that much in terms of the overall intuition here. US cities tended to be in the top third, middle third were Canada, and the bottom third were Mexico. But there was a lot more intermingling this year than there was in 2020. And so you'll start to see some intermingling here as well, whereas you have a space between Edmonton at 78 and Calgary at 82, and then you have St. John's, Halifax, and Toronto. That's because there was some intermingling with the Mexican cities. And here are the top 5 Mexican cities. 86, you have Tijuana. 87, San Pedro. Tepic, I believe I pronounced that correctly. My apologies if I don't. And then there's a jump to 92 of Leon, and then Saltillo at 93. And so we had some intermingling of some Canadian cities. In fact, if I'll just check my notes here, those intermingled cities after Tepic, you get Ottawa at 89, and then Saskatoon at 90, and Moncton at 91, and then back into Leon at 92. So we had some intermingling of cities in the middle and in the sort of middle third and bottom third in a way we didn't see in DBNA 2019. Now, what are these categories that I keep referring to? Well, let's go with starting a business, which is basically all the procedures required. And we count those number of procedures to start a business, get all your permits and approvals and licenses. But there's a time and a cost that's involved in that. Of course, time is a form of cost, and longer number of days to get these things are going to score lower because it takes longer to get this in a city. But of course, the amount of fees required and also the money, the time cost is also included in our time and cost measurements as well. So this is basically just starting the business, getting yourself up and running. But once you're up and running, you're going to need to hire workers. And so we have labor regulatory burdens that we measure in this, such as the minimum wage, which we measure as a % of per capita personal income, whether the city or state mandates paid sick and parental leave, and we measure that in calendar days. That's not to say that a company shouldn't offer these sorts of things, but we're just simply saying if a government requires it, it's going to increase the cost of doing business. It's going to decrease the ease of doing business, which is exactly the kind of thing we're measuring in the Doing Business North America report. Now we've got getting electricity. We've actually expanded this category since last year. Generally speaking, it's meant to measure the cost of electricity as it was in DBNA in 2019, but we also included reliability of electricity and of the electrical grid and competitiveness in that electrical grid. So we actually have new measures that look at the duration and the frequency of power outages in a city. Usually that was states in origin. A place like California, if you're a business there, you probably understand the economic drain that can happen when you have an unreliable electrical grid. But there's also some competitiveness angles here too. Not every state requires you to only deal with the electrical monopoly in your area. And so we included some very, very small variable, but it's still there to try to measure the number of electrical providers as well. But cost and reliability were the main parts of the getting electricity category. Land and space use, as I said, is sort of a reformulated registering property. And mainly what we're looking for is, first of all, the time and cost and reliability of the procedures related to obtaining and processing of land deeds. That's where the registering property part comes in. But the land and space use is a new addition for us, because we wanted to look at the number of approvals and zoning boards that need to require those approvals for a commercial property to be zoned or rezoned. There's a corollary here in the Wharton Residential Regulatory Land Use Index. They look at these types of zoning restrictions using a scope, or more specifically, their scope is residential property. We're looking at commercial property because the argument for residential property is the same for commercial property. And that is, if you have too many strict regulations, you're going to diminish the supply of commercial property. As a result, you'll be driving up rents. That's going to increase the cost of doing business for a landowner, a building owner, or even someone who's renting that land. We also have a specific metric in there that looks at required parking allotments for commercial buildings. And of course, again, this is an example of a regulatory burden where the government is telling a property owner they have to have a certain amount of parking per building. That may not actually be feasible or even the best use of that land. We want to let the market and the private landowner decide those things. And so putting these into the zoning category made a lot of sense. We're really excited about this because I think there's a lot of opportunity for scholars to take the data in this category in particular and try to correlate this with certain types of commercial property trends alongside the residential trends that are measured by the Wharton School Index. Paying taxes, that seems pretty straightforward. And sure enough, we've got a lot of publicly available data that look at personal, corporate, and commercial property tax rates in a city. Personal and corporate typically are state level taxes, but there are some city level personal corporate taxes. And so we do include those, and cities that get lowest, like New York, for instance, they have a personal income tax at the city level. And so their score is dinged because of that. But of course, commercial property tax rates, typically those are county, but those are also included as well. We also have a measure of gross receipts taxes. Again, some of those are different in different states. Some states that don't have a corporate income tax instead have a gross receipts tax. From an economist perspective, those are actually worse than corporate taxes. So we decided to measure those as well. But some cities also have city level versions of those taxes. All of those are included in the paying taxes category. Finally, we get to resolving insolvency, which is basically the time and the cost it takes to declare bankruptcy and to liquidate your assets. This is an important measure of national bankruptcy policy, which is the reason why cities in the US are going to all be ranked first, because the US ranked first in this category. Second is Canada. So all the Canadian cities ranked second, and third, Mexican have relatively centralized, but also very poorly designed bankruptcy law, and so therefore they ranked third. So whenever you see this in the rankings, it's not that any specific city ranked better than the other, it's because their country might have ranked better than the other. And we think all of these together create a really interesting snapshot of where cities rank relative to one another and how easy or difficult it is to do business in that city. But this is also modular in nature. With those 6 categories, you can correlate different outcomes with different types of trends. Presumably taking the specific data that we have here in just individual category areas and finding out some interesting work you can do on this from a research perspective. So I'm going to close with what might be considered a proof of concept, an idea that I put together with the DBNA 2019 data that we published as a research note on the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty's website. One important point to make about DBNA, and I failed to mention it at the front end, is that we are focusing our attention on small and medium-sized businesses. These are businesses that we define as having under 50 employees or 50 employees or less. It doesn't mean that these types of metrics aren't important for big businesses, but I would argue from, say, a political economy perspective, that large companies are often able to, in a sense, buy their way out of some of these burdens by getting special tax jurisdictions or special dispensation and treatment by a city government if they're moving a headquarters in. So a lot of these regs and tax policies don't apply to those larger businesses. And so we think small and medium-sized businesses are worth focusing on, not only that reason, but also because they compose the largest employment share in most cities combined. So we would expect cities that have high scores on the ease of doing business, rank up higher in our ranks, are going to have better business growth in the small and medium-sized category. Census Bureau actually publishes something called the County Business Patterns data set that disaggregates business types by employee. They also do it by industry category, but we were mostly interested in the employee aspect. So we took the small and medium-sized businesses out of that data set, 50 employees and under, and wanted to see what does the business growth and startup potential, or as the number of startups in that 50 employees and below category, how they correlate and relate to the ranks. And so we have top 10 in DBNA 2019, over 6.5% growth between 2014 and 2017 for business starts and business growth. Top 20 went down a little bit lower, 5.27, but still substantially higher than both the bottom 10 and the bottom 20 ranks for DBNA. And so we think there's some interesting there, if you will. We think researchers will be able to use this new augmented data set, new number of cities, new number of variables to do some really interesting work in the future. So thank you very much. And any further questions, obviously, we'll do some Q&A at the end. But right now, I want to pass it over to Dean so we can show us a little bit about how this kind of stuff integrates with the kind of work that he does and other folks do on economic freedom rankings generally.
Great. Thanks, Steve. I'm really super excited about this DBNA project. I think it holds the potential to be very valuable to researchers like myself and others who are interested in the policy differences across areas. And so let me share my screen here. Okay, there we go. Sorry for the delay there, a bit slow. Okay, so Steve Slavinsky and I overlapped, as Ross mentioned at the Cato Institute. We both were involved with a project there, kind of similar in spirit to what we're both doing now, in which we were measuring fiscal policy of America's governors. And in fact, they still do that report every 2 years. It just came out a couple days ago or last week, I think it was. But anyhow, I want to share with you some thoughts about measuring economic freedom in America. The project that I got involved with about 8 years ago now is called the Economic Freedom of North America. It's the Fraser Institute, which is a think tank in Canada. And we rank the Canadian provinces as well as the US and Mexican states. It was first published back in 2002. And the next report should be out in November, and that'll be our 16th edition. And like I said, I've been involved with the last 8 of these. So I wasn't there at the founding of this, and the methodology has been tweaked, but essentially remains the way it was developed earlier. So anyway, be that as it may. So what is economic freedom? This is kind of the textbook definition from the country level report called Economic Freedom of the World, also by the Fraser Institute in cooperation with think tanks all over the country like Cato here in the US, et cetera. I like to think of it a little more simply as simply the freedom of individuals to use their resources, time, money, et cetera, as they wish, as long as they're not hurting someone else. And so what we do in these indexes is we capture data that measures government interventions in the economy that restricts that freedom. And so it was about 35 years ago now, I think, when Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, and a bunch of other economists and public policy institute people got together and thinking back, this was in the Cold War when there was a lot of talk about how, a lot of debate about, well, what's the best way to govern a society? What are the best economic institutions to have? The data coming out of the Soviet Union, if you were to believe it, made it seem like, well, socialism's fine. It gives you a great, strong economy. And so what these guys were kind of grappling with was, how can we come up with a measure that allows us to test that hypothesis, some measure of the level of economic freedom that people enjoy in different societies. And so that they came up with what's called the Economic Freedom of the World Index. It has currently 43 variables across 5 broad areas of policy. that you can see listed there. A few years after that, they said, well, you know what? There's variation within countries too, right? Look in the US. Steve mentioned a couple good examples, but the New Yorks and the Californias tend to be more interventionist than the Texases and the Floridas. And so they came up with what's called the Economic Freedom of North America Index, again, which I've been involved with here the last few years. It contains 10 variables across 3 areas. And so I want to briefly kind of explain why there are still only 3 areas in this index and why the first one, size of government, is essentially split into 2. The rationale there is that because states get and local governments get substantial federal aid grants from this federal government, there can often be a very large difference between the own source revenue taken from their own citizens in that state and how much is spent in the state. So we got to break those apart to capture that factor. And then going back here for the countries, sound money, freedom trade internationally, these are national level policies that we couldn't really, states don't have anything to do with. So we couldn't do anything with areas 3 and 4. Areas 2 and 5 are very poorly measured. My name's on the report, and I'm willing to admit that, yes, we're not capturing legal system and property rights very well. We're not capturing regulation very well. We have a category called labor market freedom where we attempt to pick up some of the regulatory stuff in labor markets at least. But ultimately, there's a missing link here. And that's why I'm so excited about the DBNA, because at least on the regulation front, it is a great way to fill that gap, because they're essentially looking at replicating what the World Bank does with their doing business report for countries, and doing that for state and local governments here in North America. So we're really excited to try to find a way to incorporate that. And in a minute here, I'll give you my very back of the envelope first pass at how we can combine these two. But before we get to that, so this is last year's report, just to give you a feel for what it looks like. The blue states are the most free, the red states are the least free. And it's basically like a stoplight, red, yellow, green. So green is second most free, Arizona is in the second most free group, and then yellow is third. But you got, as I said, Texas and Florida, or of the 4 biggest states, Texas and Florida are most free, and New York and California are least free. There have been literally hundreds and hundreds of studies done in academic journal articles, in policy papers, in which people have used this data as the reason for coming up with this was to be able to test these hypotheses. So a lot of people have done that. The general conclusion has been that areas with higher levels of economic freedom tend to have higher levels of good stuff, like the level of GDP, the growth of GDP, the income even of the poorest 10%, and so forth, and lower levels of bad stuff like unemployment and infant mortality. The EFNA in particular, the state level report, has now been cited in over 300 such studies, and it's compared to other state indices, it's been produced the longest. It's the only one being updated every year, and it has the most years of data, 37, which of course is important for statistical analysis to get those additional units of observation. Okay, so this is pulled from the last report just to give you a feel. We break them in kind of similar to what Steve presented with the DBNA data. On the right-hand side, the most free group had, and this is across the 3 North American countries, excuse me, had income, per capita income levels that were 9.2% above average in that country. And the least free were below average by 3.4%. So about a 12.5% spread there between the least free and the most free on the level of per capita income. On growth of per capita income versus growth of economic freedom, we saw a positive relationship. It's not a super strong correlation, but there's certainly a positive association between those two variables. All right, so now we take, what I've done here is I've taken the DBNA, top 10 and bottom 10. And by the way, well, I'll get to that in a minute, but let's just, I'm honing in on the states, not the local cities, sorry. And I've put then next to it, what was that state's rank in the most recent EFNA. Now, so the DBNA is the data that Steve just talked about, which he shared with me a little while ago. So that's collected last year. So that's for 2019. It's the 2020 report. The EFNA is the 2019 report, since the 2020 is not done yet. But it's a 2-year lag in that data due to just data availability on the fiscal stuff. So as you can see, there's some right off the top. Mississippi is first in DBNA and 42nd in EFNA. South Carolina is third in DBNA, 29th in EFNA. There are 4 states here: South Dakota, Oklahoma, Georgia, and Texas, who were all in that top quintile, top 10. But most of them weren't. And I think that's important evidence that what the DBNA is providing is something distinct and unique that's not incorporated into what we're doing right now, and all that much more important. Same thing kind of can be seen from the bottom 10, where there's even fewer of them in the same quintile, although New York and California are last and 54th in the EFNA. So they're both right down there near the bottom, as well as Oregon. All right, so here's what I did. And as you notice, those scores were on a 0 to 10 basis for the DBNA. I just took the scores and divided them by 10. For states with more than one city, and there's a number of those, I created a statewide average by calculating a population-weighted average. So it took Los Angeles score, multiplied it by Los Angeles population, took San Diego's and so forth, and then divided by the total to get a population weighted score there for the states with more than one city, more than one city in the DBNA. So what I did is I dropped area 3, labor market freedom, and simply plugged in this DBNA state average, and so it's the score. The new score that I'm going to present here in a minute is the average of the existing area 1 on taxes, area 2 on government spending, and the DBNA on the ease of doing business. All right, so this is the DBNA, and I'm just for simplicity calling the EFNA plus DBNA. The correlation coefficient is a little bit higher. The top state, Mississippi, is, instead of being 42nd, is 37th. There's now 5 of the top 10 that are in the top 10 also in this new combined index, and as well as 5 of the bottom 10. So yeah, just comparing the two, the correlation coefficient for the EFNA plus DBNA goes to 0.572 from 0.437. Of course, it's going to go up because you included the DBNA, but just putting that out there to show you what the numbers were. 5 of the top 10 and bottom 10 in the DBNA were in the same quintile in the EFNA plus DBNA, compared to only 4 and 3 if you just use the EFNA as structured. Overall, looking at all 50 states, 17 of the 50 states were in the same quintile, EFNA plus DBNA versus DBNA, compared to only 13 for the EFNA on its own. And so I have, someone I think mentioned the local index. I basically took the EFNA methodology and drilled down to the metropolitan area level. So the DBNA is cities. This looks at metro areas. So it complicates the, the process in terms of trying to combine the two, but we're still early in the process, but nevertheless, I decided, well, look, I'll just do what I just did for the states and do that for the local, the metro areas. And the timing is off too, because the best local fiscal data comes out every 5 years. And the 2017 data came out late last year, and I'm in the process of updating, but I haven't quite finished that off yet. But these are the top 10 from last years of available data: Houston, Jacksonville, Tampa. Kind of expected cast of characters. And the bottom, you got a bunch of Californias and New Yorks. And this is all metro areas, which of course includes some areas that are fairly small. But this list, these two lists actually are focused in on only the top, the largest ones. I think it was 51, the ones with 1 million or over in population. All right, so same exercise repeated. We've got the MEFI, Metro Economic Freedom Index. If you just use it the way it's structured, that is just like the EFNA, you get 3 of the top 10 the same and 2 of the bottom 10 the same. If you combine it with the DBNA rank or the DBNA score, you end up with 4 of the top 10 the same and 7 of the bottom 10 the same. So you get that improved correlation coefficient, of course, but you also see that you get some changes that are significant, which again is evidence that what the DBNA is providing is something that we at the EFNA project are not currently accounting for well. We're not measuring it well, and that's why we're so excited about this DBNA project and the great potential it holds to help us out in our attempt to measure economic freedom, because this stuff matters a great deal. And so we're looking forward to hopefully being able to incorporate this in the future. I'll close with a couple quotes. The sum of good government is a wise and frugal government which shall restrain men from injuring one another, leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. In other words, the sum of good government is a good score on the DBNA and the EFNA. This somewhat less highfalutin source, the great U2 musician Bono, apparently at some point met with the previous president, and told him that capitalism has been the most effective ideology we've ever known in taking people out of extreme poverty. And I guess the message maybe didn't take so well, but finally, Adam Smith, the founding father of economics, no human wisdom or knowledge could ever be sufficient for the proper performance of the duty of superintending the industry of private people and of directing it towards the employments most suitable to the interests of the society. In other words, we as individuals don't know where resources should be used. Therefore, we should not try to use industrial policy, for lack of a better term, to kind of intervene in the economy and pick winners and losers. And I said finally, but one more. Now this is evidence that sometimes pictures are worth 1,000 words. It's probably gratuitous in this audience. Most of you maybe have seen this. It's simply a nighttime satellite photo of the Korean Peninsula. And to me, this is strong evidence that you don't need a 15-minute PowerPoint presentation to understand that governing institutions matter, that they affect the level of economic prosperity. Either that or the people in South Korea are just wasteful with their light usage. But nevertheless, except for Pyongyang, where the dictator is, in North Korea, those guys either don't have lights or have been convinced to turn them off at night. With that, I will stop talking, and thank you for listening, and thank you to Steve and the crew at ASU for putting together this project and for including me on the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean, for joining us, and Steve also for participating in this. We're going to turn to questions now, and we have a couple already in, but we would welcome other questions from participants. And as was indicated at the beginning, if you could put your question in the Q&A button down at the bottom, we'd be happy to welcome them. A question that we had quite actually early on was, and this is probably directed to Steve, have you considered including San Juan, Puerto Rico? The World Bank gives Puerto Rico a low ease of doing business score, so he suspects that San Juan would be near the bottom. But what do you think about including San Juan in our DBNA report?
It's a great idea. And in fact, we've already decided to do that, as Ross and I have had a discussion about this. We're going to be doing that for the DBNA 2021. So stay tuned. The nice thing about doing this on an annual basis is it allows us to add new cities. Now most of our cities have been added for Canada and the US. I failed to mention this. We actually have a Mexican partner for the project, Caminos de la Libertad, in Mexico City. They actually also do the Mexican data collection for economic freedom of North America. So there is that commonality there between our two projects as well. But a lot of people were asking about San Juan, and we realized, well, it does seem like an important thing. It is a business jurisdiction, and it is within the US scope, if you will. We're also thinking about how we add cities to future editions. And so up until now, we've basically settled on the idea of population thresholds. We say, okay, as long as a city is big enough and it's in a big enough state, we have one city per state at least. But of course, some states are bigger than others in terms of population. So we decided to say, okay, we'll cap it. We'll say 3 or 4 maybe cities for the biggest states. And then for every other state, you get 1, maybe 2. And we've been able to expand that number in DBNA 2020. But we started beginning to wonder about the fact that people are leaving rather onerously taxed and regulated states like California and New York. And so even though they still have the largest populations, they may not be the most indicative of where businesses are starting. And so we wanted to add a new element to this. And so next year we're toying with the idea of adding cities based not on the size of the state in which they're currently in, but the growth of the state in which they're currently in. And so places where people are moving are going to begin to get more cities represented in DBNA. And I think that will only make it more robust and more interesting as a research tool over time. Another thing we want to let people know about, of course, is only our second year, so we don't have the luxury of EFNA of having dozens of years or more, but we do over time expect to have a time series that would allow us to link all of these cities, and we may do what EFNA was able to do a little while ago, which is sort of backward engineer earlier years. So these are all on our roadmap, but I can clarify and confirm, without a doubt, San Juan, Puerto Rico will be in DBNA 2021.
Can I just say briefly on Puerto Rico, we too have been in have been in efforts to incorporate them into the EFNA. I mean, there's some issues with comparability of data that we haven't been able to get past, but we've been working with some folks at Think Tank there, and it's not really a state per se, but so there's issues there. And by the way, one of the things I think I neglected to mention when I presented the EFNA methodology is that the primary reason we don't include regulation and legal structure and property rights is difficulties with getting comparable data across US, Canada, and Mexican subnational jurisdictions. And so it's not as if we think that stuff doesn't matter. It's just that you need a Herculean effort like Steve and his team have gone through to really collect that data, to get that regulatory piece. And then we need a similar effort to get the legal structure and property rights piece. And of course, I think on property rights, some of that doesn't differ as much within the US as it does across countries, but it's something that would be useful to include, but that's all.
And I'll add to this that we're also looking at adding a couple of the capitals of the Canadian territories as well. And we're not sure yet. There's data issues that similar to what Dean was mentioning with some of the American territories as well. And so these are ongoing efforts to try to expand the realm of the data that's available for looking at subnational and even sub-state, sub-provincial, sub-territory levels. And that's an interesting ongoing project. But Puerto Rico is definitely on the DBNA horizon for sure, and sounds like potentially as well for EFNA within some kind of time frame. The second question we have on the role of questions is, what do you think about, this would be either one of you to address, what are your thoughts about rolling back regulations? The commentator, the questioner, thinks that regulations are usually put in place for a reason, even though they do cost time and money. So what's the balance between accomplishing what the regulation sets out to do without hindering economic growth? Is there empirical data that proves that regulations slow growth and cause harm to communities?
Sure. I'll start, and I'm sure Dean's got some thoughts on that as well. There is substantial empirical evidence in economics journals about regulation, and specifically over an excessive regulation. And I say that for a specific reason. Economists would all agree that regulations that protect property are a good thing, right? So the idea of a legal structure being a form of regulation, that's a useful thing, because if you're able to ascribe the value, more specifically, I guess, maintain ownership and actually prove ownership, you will then be more likely to maintain that land, build on that land. So less developed economies that don't have that kind of protection of property rights in a regulatory form that does that sort of basic fundamental protection of that right, that's a useful regulation. But then when you go further into the mix of more developed economies, cities or states, that say, we're gonna protect your property, but we're gonna attenuate it some way by telling you have to do X, Y, and Z with that property. That's when you then begin into the territory of government making decisions that might conflict with the most efficient use of that property. And so those types of regulations are the kinds of things that we're trying to measure. We're actually trying to measure both, by the way. You know, the idea of registering property and being able to prove that property is yours is an important part of DBNA, but we also want to measure the excessive burdens that we're seeing at the city and state level as well.
Yeah, sure. I agree with all of that. One of the things that and I'm not as familiar with the country level literature, and the EFTA doesn't include regulations per se. So, but I know that one of the things that researchers often do when they're using these economic freedom indices is they'll not only look at that overall score, but they'll break it down by component. So I'm fairly certain that a lot of the literature that's looked at economic freedom and things like growth of the economy, growth of businesses, et cetera, have zeroed in on that area 5 in the country level index regulations. And one other point on that is that a lot of times people will point at some of the Scandinavian countries and some of the Western European social democracies and say, well, what's wrong with those countries? They're in really good shape. And if you look at the scores on the Economic Freedom of the World Index, they do much better at regulations than we do. They get much higher scores there. They do a much better job at kind of sensibly regulating their economy. They just have huge welfare states. So in Area 1 on size of government, they have a lot of taxes and a lot of spending, but at least in terms of the way they restrict business activity, it's done more sensibly. So we could learn from them on some things, maybe not on some of the things that Bernie Sanders wants us to learn from them, but they do get it right on regulations at least.
I'll just add as well a brief comment about one of the benefits of drilling down to the city level is the city level regulation often is driven by interests that are able to capture city government voting and are put in place to protect special interests in the city. And so you get all kinds of interesting land use regulations. For example, not being able to run a business out of your home, for example, would be one kind of example, or space and other kinds of regulations of activity. So getting down to the level of a city introduces a whole new level of thinking about how a government regulates and what it is they regulate and what it is they mandate and what it is that they require you to do. The next question comes from somebody who uses the DBNA in research and is excited to look at the new edition. The questioner says, I know that the DBNA in 2020 has many more quality measures to better understand the cities. Are all the old variables maintained in this version in case we need to match and compare between the years? I would also be interested in hearing more about the land use regulation changes. So I guess this is over to you, Steve.
Sure, absolutely. Yes, yes, those are maintained year to year. So basically, if you want to only look at a specific category, you can actually disaggregate each of those categories and compare them over years. So in some sense, we do have 2 years of data for the variables that were consistent between 2019 and 2020. The new variables, of course, in electricity and in the zoning category are new, so we don't have them for 2019. I do want to point out, again, something I forgot, all of this data is downloadable for anyone who wants it, both years simultaneously. If you go to our website, dbna.asu.edu, you go into the download all data section, they'll ask you for your email and then they'll send you the link to download the data. And we want that to be publicly available to everyone who wants to use it, because I think it's important for people to, first of all, be able to drill down, but also to allow researchers to do exactly what the question was asking, which is the fact that you can take specific sections of the DBNA in a modular way and begin to start correlate and match over time and between areas, the different types of variables we're using. And actually, I sake of disclosure, I know the questioner, Alicia's really great on these issues, and she has been using the DBNA data, and luckily she shared with me some of the research she's been doing on this. So I do hope that in the future, another one of our goals is to start promoting research that is being done with the DBNA, and do so through our DBNA website and through our newsletter at the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty. So, so stay tuned for some more on those types of things as well in the coming year.
Can I follow up on that? And hi, Alicia. Good question. I just want to make sure I'm clear in understanding what the difference is between 2020. Not the difference, but for the newest release, does it contain data for both years, or does it contain data just for the most recent year? In other words, do I have 2 years of comparable data for the cities that were in there both years, or is it, in other words, is it backward updated, I guess?
Right. No, so we don't back update. So
Right.
basically,
Yeah.
not yet anyway. That's
Okay.
one of the goals is to try to do that. When you download the data, you'll get both the 2019 set and the 2020 set. So
Gotcha.
whenever you go to the 2020 website, it'll basically have all the ranks and scores, and then you can get the archive data in the download all data function. And you can actually go to get the original report from 2019 as well. The methodology and everything is there and consistent. So you'll be able to see that. The new categories, of course, we won't have them for 2019 yet, although we might at some point in the future. So again, the goal would be if something was in 2019, either a city or a category or a variable, it will be consistent between 2019 and 2020. Okay. But if you have a new city or a new variable, there won't be a comparable version for 2019 yet.
So
but you're able to download the data for both. Yeah,
I mean, just thinking off something, you could then produce, a researcher could take the new data and could they produce a 2019 methodology version with updated numbers? I guess if you could just dropping out the new stuff.
Yep, it certainly could be done. In fact, that's something we have on our roadmap to do. Great. So yeah, that would be the goal because we really want to make it a time series that's usable. Right. And having 3 years is certainly, and going from 2021 back to 2019 is better than just having 2 discrete years that aren't always comparable depending upon the city you're choosing. Right, and I didn't mean that as criticism. I know you know that, Steve, but just this stuff is hard and time consuming, and researchers just want to pull the data and have tons of data and don't understand the work that's involved. So I understand that it's tough to get that done, but I just want to make sure I understood what the deal was there. So no worries, good job.
Well, we can compliment Paul Bernert indirectly here as the research technician designing all the hands-on data collection processes and working with the students that we have to develop the be tuned to those to fine-tune issues. And here's another one that's a question close to the data. For the starting a business category in DBNA, how do you account for the differences across business types? For example, you could have a food business that has a different number of procedures than a retail business to go through. So so what did you do for the procedures for registering a business category?
Right. This is always a challenge when you're doing things like this because we're trying to remain agnostic as possible to the type of business or even the business model that we're trying to measure. The World Bank also has challenges to deal with this as well. The assumption we make, however, in particular with starting a business, although we do this across the board, is we're trying to find the procedures that are the most common for the most types of businesses as possible. So yes, it's certainly possible there are very specific businesses and unique niches, if you will, that are going to have a few different types of procedures. But for the most part, they're going to have the basic number of procedures, at least, that we're trying to measure. So again, we have to make some assumptions about businesses. We certainly make assumptions, say, about employee count, for instance, although a lot of times with starting a business category, that's not as significant. It's more significant for, say, the tax part of it, for instance. But yeah, we try to do our best to make sure that we are making this as comparable as possible for all types of businesses, while also acknowledging that there may be certain types of industries and certain types of businesses that aren't necessarily always overlapping with the list of things that we're looking at. So, but again, it is a challenge, and I certainly am sympathetic to that.
Yeah. So this is aimed at both of you, I think. What are your thoughts regarding the effect of this year's pandemic on the next DBNA?
Well, yeah, I can definitely speak to that. One of the things that we want to do in the future is on the land and space use category. And there's a reason we decided to call it the land and space use and not zoning per se. Because zoning is typically thought of as a brick and mortar type operation, right? Because I mean, there's things that you can do, you build or you can't build, or a certain type of business and certain type of thing you can and can't do. But those zoning laws have been expanding their scope over the years, and certainly more recently, to include home-based businesses. So these are people working in their home, but there are certain tax provisions that get kicked into gear when you start your own home business. And then there's certain types of zoning codes that have been broadly expanded, I would say overly expansive, to include what you do in your home relative to business activity. So we called it land and space use because home is on land, but it's space within the home that's being used for a business that might also trigger some type of regulatory code violations. So we want to go ahead and try to include those in a future year as well. And some cities are better than others. We hear about certain restrictions on Airbnb and things like that. I think those are very important things to include in a ranking like this going forward.
In regards to the FNA, since it's primarily, most of the data in there is fiscal, and there's a 2-year lag in that data, and it's availability from the Census Bureau. This will be not an issue in next year's, but certainly it will be an issue going forward. One of the things that I think people don't fully appreciate is that at the local level, because housing prices have in general continued to rise, there hasn't been the huge budget crises in most places. There are exceptions that the states have faced, because the states have seen income tax revenues, those who have them. Fortunately, we don't here, but I've seen those receipts fall off a cliff, and sales tax revenues have been down as well. But so yeah, there'll be some impact there, kind of across the board, and certainly those states who had bigger outbreaks are probably going to see the bigger cutbacks in spending and revenue. But the thing is, we measure this as a percent of income. So in most cases, the income probably fell more than the revenue. So it's because otherwise you'd say, well, they had a huge cut in spending because they had to, and revenue fell. They're going to go up in the index because they have more freedom now. But it's not quite that simple, because it's a ratio thing. We look at it as ratio income.
Okay. Well, thank you both for contributing to the webinar today, and for both introducing us to the DBNA report, and also to the EFNA report and the relationship between them, and also how they help us understand economic freedom in a sense on the ground level, as opposed to in terms of general categories that we discuss so often in the university with students, but they don't necessarily understand what the impact is at the ground level. I also want to thank Mason Hunt, who's the project coordinator for the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty, who kept the webinar running smoothly and handled the question process. His planning made this a success, and he makes it go so as smoothly as these things do. I have a couple announcements about upcoming webinars that the center is doing. In 2 weeks, on October 21st, the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty will host a conversation between myself and Antoine Murphy. Antoine is a retired professor of economics from Trinity College, Dublin, and he and I share a fascination with the connections between Richard Cantillon, the banker and monetary theorist who coined the term entrepreneur, and John Law, the gambler, banker, and economic theorist, who was the first person to be called a millionaire. In fact, the term millionaire was coined in reference to John Law. In 1720, 300 years ago this year, events collided to bring about financial bubbles in both Paris, the Mississippi scheme, the so-called Mississippi scheme, and in London, the South Sea bubble, which coincided with the last great pandemic in Europe, in the city of Marseille. We will discuss these historical events as well as their connection to today's economic prospects in a time of pandemics. Antoine's essay, entitled "Two Bubbles and a Plague," an account of those events in 1720, is available at the center's website, and I encourage you to read the essay and join the discussion. After the event with Antoine will come in early November, on November 5th to 7th, a Zoom webinar conference, the Conference on Voluntary Governance. You will find the Conference on Voluntary Governance scheduled quite soon. The purpose of the Conference of Voluntary Government is to examine creative and consensus-building responses to social problems and examine how people construct these, one might say, from the bottom up. Vincent Ostrom once observed that human relationships are integrally bound together through artisanship and the artifactual character of human creations that are constitutive of our cultures, societies, and civilizations as aggregate patterns of order. They're built from the bottom up rather than from the top down. And the future of self-governance depends upon citizenry who refuse to allow government to be the sole agent and the only arbiter of their happiness, to quote Tocqueville. In a free society, robust citizenship requires more than just voting and policy advocacy, but also active engagement in crafting community together. We are bringing together a group of scholars from around the world, actually, to discuss this notion of voluntary governance and its impact in specific communities around the world. I hope you can join us for those events. And thank you very much for joining us for the Doing Business North America release. Thank you.